Hello everyone, my name is Ekaterina, or Katrina as everyone calls me, O'Neill, and today I want to explore the experiences of twice exceptional Russophone families residing in the United States from both a personal perspective and a community perspective. I will begin by talking about my personal experience and experience of my family of being bilingual, bicultural, and twice exceptional and living in the United States. Then I will proceed to talk about a small study that I've been running in the past year within the twice exceptional Russophone community that I belong to in the United States and compare other families' experiences with my own experience. And finally, if time permits, I will conclude with talking about why we want to discuss culturally diverse twice exceptional families in general. I also want to warn you that I'm going to run a few experiments, a few simulations on you, but don't get alarmed. Should be fun. They're not scary. And we'll see how it goes. Shall we begin? Итак, меня зовут Екатерина О'Нил, и я родилась в бывшем Советском Союзе и прожила там до его распада в 1991 году. Так как мы жили в Киеве, то после распада Союза мы автоматически стали украинскими гражданами и уже продолжали жить в Украине. В 1996 году вся моя семья решила переехать в Соединенные Штаты Америки, и это включало и меня, и моих родителей, и моих бабушку и дедушку. Переехали мы в Калифорнию, в Сан-Франциско, потому что оба моих родителя программисты, и там я ходила в школу последние 2 года, потом я поступила в университет Сан-Диего на факультет компьютерных наук. Там я встретила своего будущего мужа Скотта, ну а потом у нас уже появилась семья, состоящая из двух нейроотличных, дважды исключительных детей Кирилла и Юли, которые вдохновили меня посвятить себя не только компьютерным наукам и компьютерной безопасности, которой я посвятила больше 20 лет, но также и нейроразнообразию. So, as you might have guessed, this was my first experiment on you, my first simulation. And usually when I talk to the audience after the simulation, I ask them how they feel, how they feel about being in this environment where they don't quite understand what is going on. And that's exactly the responses that I'm hearing usually, that they feel confused, they feel like maybe they went to the wrong talk, they don't understand what's going on. And the point behind this simulation is to demonstrate how every immigrant, when they just move to the United States or any other country, feels. They feel like they don't belong, they feel like they don't understand what's going on, the language is a barrier, and that is not a very good feeling. But shall we rewind and start from the beginning in English now? So, as I was saying in Russian, my name is Ekaterina, or Katrina O'Neill, and I was born in the former Soviet Union, where I lived until it collapsed in 1991. Because we lived in Kiev, we automatically became Ukrainian citizens and continued living in Ukraine at that point. But in 1996, my entire family decided to move to the United States, and that includes myself and my parents and my grandparents. We moved to California, San Francisco, because both of my parents are computer programmers. And so there I went to high school for the last 2 years, after which I entered the university at UC San Diego. I studied computer science, and that's where I met my future husband, Scott. Then we moved back to the Bay Area, started working. We have a family now, and we have 2 wonderful and amazing kids, Kirill and Yulia. Kirill is 15, and he is profoundly gifted and on the spectrum. Yulia is 12, and she's also profoundly gifted and dyslexic. So we have this amazing family of and twice exceptional kids, and these kids are the people who inspired me to dedicate myself not just to computer science and computer security and cybersecurity industry, where I spent my last 20 years, but they inspired me to go back to graduate school and become a doctoral student at Bridges Graduate School of Cognitive Diversity in Education. And so here I am. My other, hobbies include music. I'm a huge Queen fan. I love books. And then one other thing to mention about our family is that we are trying to visit every national park in the United States. This was the goal that my son put together a few years ago, and the entire family adopted this goal. And so now I think I lost count. I think we're at 36 or 38 at this point, but it's getting harder and harder to visit new national parks because they're getting more remote. We've mostly visited the ones that are easily accessible. And plus, they're adding more. So I don't know if we'll ever be able to visit all of them, but that's the goal. Okay, so now I want to transition to talking about my family's experience with being bilingual, bicultural, and twice exceptional. And I want to talk about these experiences for three different generations: my parents, myself, and my kids. And even though neither I nor my parents were ever diagnosed or identified as gifted, because in the former Soviet Union, nobody tested anybody, nobody talked about giftedness. We didn't know anything about Tourette's exceptionality or neurodiversity. The more I learn about these things because of my kids, the more traits of these things I see in myself and my parents. And so that's why I feel like I am able to talk about my own and my parents' experiences in the context of this talk. So I'm going to start with the generation of my parents. So my parents were there in their 40s when they moved to the United States. And, for most of their life, they lived in the country with a very different mentality, a very different way of life, and obviously a different language. And so even though my dad, studied English in school and was able to read books for work because he was a computer programmer, um, it's still different than from actually living in the country and going down the street and talking to people in English and understanding people in English. My mom, on the other hand, studied French in school, so she had to start from scratch when she moved to the United States, and she started going to community college and learning English. But the sad thing is that unfortunately people are often viewed by how they have mastered the language. And so I've seen time and time again how my parents are sort of looked down upon when others talk to them because of their mastery of language or the lack of thereof. And even though they are both highly educated people, both of them have master's degrees. My mom is a mathematician. My dad is actually a physicist. Both later became computer programmers. It's really sad to watch them struggle with the language and to watch people sort of, again, looking down upon at them. Now I want to move on and talk about my own struggles. So I came here when I was 16, and so I went to a high school in San Francisco for the last 2 years. So I started going there in 11th grade. Um, my parents went to look at public high schools in San Francisco and said, "There's no way you're going there." Honestly, I don't know. I don't remember why they decided not to let me go to a public school. I would imagine that was because they were huge and scary looking to them. But I ended up going to a private school down the street, which we just randomly walked in and then asked them whether they have any spots. And it turned out to be an amazing experience for me, actually, because it was a school for international students. There were students, well, there were American students there too, but most of the students were from other countries. And so they actually, struggled with the same things as I did, such as language, for example. And so it didn't feel as overwhelming, and it felt like I belonged because I, shared the same struggles with all these kids. Plus, the school was pretty small, so it really tried to create a nice community. And I also was able to get ahead in certain subjects and work on my own because they quickly realized that I've surpassed the math levels that they've been teaching, so I was just doing math on my own, for example. But anyway, going back to my struggles, the things that I was used to, for example, in terms of testing in my, Ukrainian, Russian, former Soviet Union school was, a few open response questions with generous time limits, and the problems on these questions, if we're talking about math, for example, were pretty complex, or at least not as straightforward. So those are the types of tests that I would use to. Obviously here, standardized tests and most tests look very different. First of all, they're multiple choice. They're very harsh time limits, and usually they consist of lots of easy problems. And so in my experience, if you don't know how to read the question, if you don't know how to solve the problem as you're reading the question, you're probably going to run out of time and not finish all of them. So just to illustrate what I'm talking about, here is, and I know you probably won't be able to read it because it's in Russian unless you know how to read in Russian. This is a sample entrance exam to Moscow State University from 1996, the year that we moved to the United States, but I checked, recent format is the same. So this is an entrance exam in math. And you can see, probably you should be able to tell that there are 6 problems here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They are not multiple choice, they're open response questions. And they're not, just like straightforward questions. Like they do require you to really show your work and show your knowledge. And so that's exactly what kinds of tests I was used to. And if you read the description of how this test is run, you're given between 6 and 7 questions, and you're given between 3 and 4 hours depending on a year. So you have plenty of time to complete everything. Okay, so another aspect of learning in school that I struggled with was writing. And it was surprising to me because in my Russian, Ukrainian, Soviet Union school, I was considered to be a good writer. And I couldn't understand why I was not considered to be a good writer here in the United States. In fact, writing didn't make sense to me for a long time. And only when I started writing articles and blog posts for my job did it start to make sense why academic and informational writing is so important and what it is all about. And so only then I started realizing what was the problem and why writing didn't make sense to me all those years. I realized that in my Russian, Ukrainian, Soviet Union school, the focus in terms of writing was on a completely different thing. It was not on academic informational writing. It was more on this fictional, poetic, descriptive language, descriptive writing, using as many adjectives as possible, making sentences as complicated as possible. And that's what you were praised for. This is not what academic writing is all about. And I think academic writing is actually more important and makes sense to teach to everybody, because everybody needs to be able to express their thoughts clearly so other people understand them. But not everybody needs to become a writer, and not everybody needs to be engaged in things like creative writing. And so just to illustrate you what I'm talking about, here is also another assignment from similar to what I would be getting in my 5th grade, for example. So the teacher would read you an excerpt from some writing, and then you would discuss it with everybody in detail. You will discuss what is going on, what kinds of literary tools are being used in this text, etc., etc. And then you would be tasked with rewriting it in your own words. And so again, the more adjectives you use, the more descriptive your language is, the more complicated the sentences are, the more you're praised. And so I'm not going to read this text to you. I just took it from online and translated it using Google Translate. But you can see, hopefully, what I'm talking about. Okay, and now I want to talk about how long division, excuse my French, screwed me over. And so, as I mentioned, I was 16 when we moved to the United States, and it just happened to be August, so my parents desperately needed to find a school for me. They were not fond of neighborhood high schools, public high schools, but then their friends mentioned that there is this really good, academically good high school in San Francisco called Lowell, but it requires entrance exams. And it just happened to be that, in a couple of days after we moved to the United States, they were holding those makeup entrance exams. The exams were in English and math, and of course I was completely freaked out because I had no idea what to expect. I was more concerned about English than math, but I was also concerned about math because I had no idea what to expect. At that point I was already studying calculus in my Ukrainian school, so I was, reviewing, what the derivative of sine and cosine was, not knowing, again, what to expect on the test. So to my relief, it turned out that the test, especially the math test, was really easy. It only consisted in some arithmetic, so multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction, and also I think there were some percentage questions or something along those lines. So I sighed with relief, finished everything, was 100% sure that I got everything correct because I was good at math. I liked math, and arithmetic was never my issue. And so then I was completely shocked to find out that I made 4 mistakes. There was absolutely no way that I could, in my mind, that I could have made those mistakes. Well, it turned out that all of them were in long division. And so now I'm going to run a second simulation, a second experiment on you and see how you do. So imagine you're given this on a test and you need to choose the answer that you think is expected of you. What would you choose? Right, so the answer is 25, so A. And it is not 0.04 or B, which is maybe something that you might have guessed. It turned out that the American way of writing down long division is a complete opposite from the Russian, Ukrainian, and Soviet Union way. And I assumed that the number on the left is the dividend and the number on the right is the divisor, whereas in the US it's the other way around. And so obviously I chose the wrong answer because the other answer was also on the list of possible multiple choice answers, and 4 times in 4 problems, long division problems, I chose the wrong answer, and that's how I didn't get into Lowell. Okay, so now I want to move on from my own and my parents' struggles to talking about my children's struggles. So turns out that their struggles started from the very beginning. They started with their pediatrician. So my husband and I decided early on that we're going to raise our kids bilingual. And so we did some research because we're nerds, and we found out that if we want to preserve a minor, in this case Russian language, and the major, in this case English environment, we want to dedicate 80% of our efforts to Russian and only 20% to English. And so that's exactly what we did. I only speak Russian to my kids. We read Russian books. We watched Russian cartoons. We went to see Russian movies and Russian plays. We went to all sorts of events in Russian. We tried to have Russian friends. We even had, hairdressers who were Russian speaking and dentists. And so we quickly realized we also need a Russian speaking pediatrician because our English speaking pediatrician, who I have nothing against, absolutely nothing against, but she could not appreciate my kids' vocabulary as they started speaking in Russian. And so we had to quickly switch to a Russian-speaking pediatrician. So similar problem we had during the time that they were tested with WISC-5. So my son was about just turned 7 when he took WISC-5 for the first time. And even though he, my husband's American and he was raised bilingual from the very beginning, because we spent so much effort and so much time trying to preserve the Russian language, I think at that point when he was 7, his vocabulary in Russian was still larger than his vocabulary in English, even though he didn't have any issues with English. He was never an English learner. He tested out of that right away. He, already was reading and writing in English, so it was not an issue. But as you know, some of the subtests of WISC actually test your vocabulary, and so I think if the test was conducted in Russian, he probably could have gotten a higher score. And plus, the test doesn't even take into account the fact that he has twice as large vocabulary because it's both Russian and English. Another example from that testing was when on one of the informational subtests he was asked a question to which he answered no, he doesn't know what that is, even though I 100% know that he did know what it was. And so I want to run another experiment and another simulation on you and see how you do. And I think that the reason he said that he doesn't know who that was or what that was is because he was used to hearing Russian pronunciation. And so again, let's see how you do. I wonder if you know who Isaac Newton is. If you guessed Isaac Newton, you were correct. And so you can see how Isaac Newton and Isaac Newton sound similar but slightly different. And so to a 7-year-old's ear, he couldn't understand that it was Isaac Newton. And the reason I know why he knew about Isaac Newton is because at that point he was already taking college level courses in astrophysics, and he was very much into science, and he learned about gravity, so he couldn't possibly not know who Isaac Newton was. Another thing that my son struggled with was avant stem forest test, which he took a couple of summers ago to get the Seal of Biliteracy award in Russian and English. And even though he still got the award, I feel like the level that he got wasn't representative of his true mastery and knowledge of Russian. And so that test consisted of 4 different parts. I think it was reading, comprehension, writing, and speaking. And so he had no problems with reading and comprehension because he reads for fun, for pleasure in Russian. So that's not a problem for him, and he understands everything. He's also very verbal, so I was surprised to find out that he struggled with speaking in Russian. And I wasn't too surprised that he struggled with writing, because writing is the hardest thing, because you don't really do writing in Russian every day. And so that's what we spend the most time practicing for. However, I later found out that the thing that he was struggling with was not the process of writing or process of speaking, but the topics that he was supposed to be speaking about and writing about. And I actually argue that these topics were not friendly to an autistic person. And so let me see what I mean. So here's the first example, which I also translated from Russian to English using Google Translate, and let me know what you think. So the first one that he mentioned to me was, tell us about the advantages and disadvantages of buying a new house versus an old house for renovation. So of course we know that our gifted twice exceptional kids sometimes have very strange interests. And so if this is one of your interests, one of your child's interests, and they're very much into housing or finances or economics, these kinds of things, then maybe they'll be able to talk your ear off about this topic. But my son was not interested in this, and so he didn't know what to say, no matter which language you ask him to talk about this. So I argued that, of course he wrote something because he still passed his test, but um, what he wrote was not representative of his knowledge of Russian. Similar to the second one. So in this case, they asked him to talk about what would you do if you have noisy neighbors. Again, for an autistic individual, this is a difficult question because it requires perspective taking and understanding social situations. And so, this is exactly what he's been working on with his speech therapist. And so, once again, even if he was asked the same question in English, he would struggle in the same way. So his struggles were not representative of struggles with the language. They were representative of struggles with being autistic. And here's a third one, which is similar to the second one. Describe how you can help senior citizens. Again, in order to answer this question, you need to understand how to view social situations, how to do perspective taking, and all of those things that autistic people usually find challenging. Now I want to switch gears and talk about my other child, my daughter, who's dyslexic. And honestly, I've been suspecting that something was going on from very early on because with our son, I don't even remember us teaching him things like numbers or digits or letters. He somehow picked everything up on his own. But with my daughter, I remember how she was struggling when we were trying to teach her the digits. We would have to explicitly say, okay, this is a 1 and this is a 2, and then 3 seconds later she would forget. And then she was also confusing things like, yesterday and tomorrow. She was flipping letters later. And of course, teachers in school, when I brought it up, kept saying that no, 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 everything's fine. She's going to grow out of it. Her reading comprehension is very good. So obviously she understands what she's reading. And so they kept saying this. I kept asking, but she kept doing it until, of course, she was in third grade, and that's when they finally said, okay, we need to test her. And so in third grade she was tested, and even though her reading comprehension was indeed at 99%, well, she's obviously compensating because she's profoundly gifted, her spelling was at 6%. And so she was diagnosed with stealth dyslexia. However, we were not given any services because she was not behind and because her reading comprehension was at 99%. But, this is a topic of a different talk. But the second she was diagnosed with stealth dyslexia, we were told, well, see, she's struggling with English, so she should drop Russian. And I was so mad and so angry because if your kids speak the second language, you know how much effort goes into that, how much effort goes into maintaining the language, both from a parent's perspective and the child's perspective. We spend so much time, so much effort finding the right resources, and with our twice exceptional gifted kids, it's pretty tricky because they are very picky and very particular about the resources that they like. And so I was not ready to drop the second language because I wanted my kids to be to know that part of my identity, that part of my culture. And so I refused, and I decided to do a little bit of research, and here's what I found out. First of all, a lot depends on what languages are at play because different languages have different characteristics, and these characteristics play differently with each other. Second, turns out our situation was not unique, and culturally and linguistically responsive practices are in fact not used in mainstream environments, which we found out ourselves when we were asked to drop the second language. After digging a little bit deeper, I found some studies that show no negative effects of bilingualism on dyslexia, and even in some cases, some advantages of being bilingual for dyslexia. And in fact, this is exactly what I think with respect to my daughter. I'm convinced that she learned how to read in English much easier because she already knew how to read in Russian. And Russian is a very phonetic language if you are not familiar with Russian. And so what that means is that there are much fewer exceptions when you go from a sound to a letter and back. So there is a one-to-one mapping between a sound and a letter. Usually, I mean, there's some exceptions, but definitely not as many as there are in English. Like a letter A has 4 different sounds. Not like that in Russian. And so it's much easier to learn how to read in Russian. And also, the way you're taught to read in Russian is a two-phase approach, and like that's how I was taught how to read. That's how my daughter was taught how to read. That's how everybody is taught how to read. First, kids are taught how to blend sounds into syllables, and then that's the first phase. And then they're taught how to put syllables together to form words. And so that two-step approach is also helpful in figuring out where the kid is struggling. So if, for example, the child is struggling with blending sounds into syllables, then you know that there's something with phonics, right? There's something with phonetics that is happening, and so that's where you need to put more effort and help the child to make more progress. However, if the child is struggling with putting syllables together to form words, then that means he's struggling with automaticity. And both of these struggles are indicative of dyslexia. It's just a matter of how much effort to put into a specific issue. And so that's why I thought that because Yulia was taught, my daughter Yulia was taught how to read in Russian, she knew that approach of how to decode words that she doesn't know. And so I think she used that approach to, decode words that she didn't know in English, because in my experience, the way they were taught in school to read in English was just to read the entire word. So basically it was memorization of every word, which means that if she comes across a word she doesn't know, she can't read it. But again, because she knew how to read in Russian, she applied the same strategy to learn how to read in English. My kids didn't just have struggles, they also had some victories. And one of the victories I just talked about, I feel like it was easier for my daughter to learn how to read in English because she knew how to read in Russian, and she's dyslexic. My son did get his Global Seal of Biliteracy Award after all, even though I feel like the level that he got is not representative of his actual knowledge and mastery of Russian language. He is capable of reading Chekhov and Dostoevsky in the original, which is amazing. He loves reading in English and in Russian for fun. Both kids can communicate with their grandparents in the native language, which is excellent. Also, now that my son started learning Spanish this last year, he's actually making a lot of connections between Spanish and Russian. So I argue that knowing Russian actually helped him to learn Spanish because there's some similarities. So, for example, Russian and Spanish both have genders, whereas English does not. And so I would imagine that somebody who is an English speaker who's learning Spanish might have more trouble with understanding genders than somebody who is a Russian speaker and learning Spanish. And also, even though my kids are getting older and it's harder and harder to influence now, and harder to keep maintaining the language, I think they're still proud that they know both languages. And in fact, one of my daughter's friends recently decided to start learning Russian because she's Russian. And so she's helping her friend with, the language and pronunciation and vocabulary. And also, now that I'm talking about it, I remember that she served as a translator between some kids and her teacher in kindergarten, and those kids just arrived to the United States, so they had trouble with English, and so my daughter served as a translator for them. So after I realized the struggles and the victories that my family went through, I started wondering, is this experience unique, or are other families having similar experiences? And so once I started on my doctoral journey at British Graduate School of Cognitive Diversity in Education, I decided to run a small study on the experiences of twice exceptional Russophone families residing in the United States. This study has been going on for a year now. It's still open, so here's the QR code and here's the link to the study in case you know any Russian-speaking families residing in the United States who would be willing and interested in participating. The purpose of this study, the goal of it, was threefold. First of all, I wanted to explore the challenges and benefits of twice exceptional Russophone families residing in the United States with respect to experiences with child development, education, during assessments, workplace, and everyday life in general. Then I wanted to also bring awareness about these challenges and victories to the educators in the United States so that they're better equipped to support these kinds of kids. And so that's exactly what I'm doing now, speaking to you and spreading information and awareness about the experiences of these children and their families. And the third was bringing awareness of neurodiversity, giftedness, twice exceptionality, and learning differences to members of the Russophone community that I am part of, because, as I mentioned, having grown up in the former Soviet Union, none of us knew what giftedness was all about, or at least very few of us knew what giftedness was about, what twice exceptionality was about, because nobody really talked to us about it when we were growing up then. And so in addition to running this study, I'm also writing about my family's personal experiences with giftedness, twice exceptionality, and learning differences on my Substack in Russian. I'm also doing that, translating that into Ukrainian as well, because there's very a few resources in Russian and none basically in Ukrainian about any of these topics. And also a couple of months ago, together with my friend, a Russian-speaking psychologist, we started a Facebook group for twice exceptional Russophone families. And so if you know of any of such families who would be interested, see me afterwards and I will give you information about how to access the group and how to access my Substack. In order to participate in my study, you had to be an adult 18 plus, so I only talked to the parents, even if I talked not just about the parents' experiences, but also children experiences. You had to be part of a Russophone family and you had to be residing in the United States. Here are some of the general statistics about my study. Because it was an IRB approved study, I had to collect signatures. So I collected 84 signatures and 64 responses, which makes response rate to be about 76%, which is not bad. In the end, I had 62 fully qualified responses because 2 people said that they were not Russian speaking. Unfortunately, my study was very biased and skewed towards people in California and especially my friends, because I am part of the big Russian-speaking community in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so that's why lots of people that I know responded to my survey, and they were mostly from California, so almost 80% of responders were from California, but I do have responses from other states as well. The first 4 questions, real questions of this study, were general questions because I wanted to understand the state of things with the Russian-speaking community in general with respect to their knowledge and understanding of certain terms. And so my first question was about whether they're familiar with the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergent. And so you can see that about 3/4 were familiar and about 1/4 were not. I also asked about their familiarity with the term giftedness, and you can see that pretty much everybody knew what giftedness was all about. Fewer people knew about learning differences. And when I asked about twice exceptionality, only 57% 7% knew what twice exceptionality was all about. Interestingly, my next question was about whether you or your children are twice exceptional. And in this case, I actually explained what twice exceptionality means. And so in this case, some of the responders who said no to a previous question about whether you're familiar with the term twice exceptional said yes to this question. And so that tells me that even though they're having the twice exceptional experiences, they were not familiar with the term. And so you can see that about 42% said that they were twice exceptional. And so the rest of the survey questions were targeted towards those who responded as yes. There were 26 responses that mentioned that they were twice exceptional or that their kids were twice exceptional. And so my first question was about the nature of learning differences. And I want to emphasize that none of the responders chose or picked just one neurodivergence or learning difference. Everybody picked more than one. And you can see that anxiety wins. 17 people mentioned anxiety, so that makes it about 65%. Next was ADHD. 16 people mentioned ADHD. Third was autism and Asperger's, which is basically the same thing at this point. So 14 people together mentioned autism. Then we have dyslexia with 4 people, dysgraphia 3, dyscalculia 2. Nobody mentioned dyspraxia, and I'm guessing that's because people are just not familiar with the term, because I think the term is more widespread in the UK. And then there were an opportunity to enter your own responses, and so several people entered their own, including selective mutism, PANS, and others. Next question was about the challenges that you or your kids have experienced due to being bilingual, bicultural, and twice exceptional. And so you can see that overwhelmingly, at 73% and 19 people, responders said feeling of not fitting in school environment or workplace environment or just surroundings in general. And this is very common for all twice exceptional and gifted families and kids. 11 mentioned being viewed as less smart because of being twice exceptional and bicultural and bilingual. And also 11 mentioned an ability by others, such as teachers or assessors or examiners, to appreciate their vocabulary in another language. 9 mentioned not being identified for gifted services, and 8 not being identified for special ed services, which again is very common among twice exceptional families because gifts often mask learning differences and vice versa. But when we're adding another culture into the mix, it becomes even harder to identify kids for the right services. Also, 8 people mentioned that they experienced cultural bias in their environment. And let's see, what else? Being passed over for promotion was mentioned by 4 people. Having a hard time helping their kids with homework because the homework is in a different language was mentioned by 3 people. Being fired from work was mentioned by 2 people. And then there were other open-ended responses that didn't quite fit the actual question. I also asked about the benefits that these families see of being bilingual, bicultural, and twice exceptional. 20 people mentioned being able to communicate with older generations in their language. And also 20 people mentioned being more open towards and accepting of other cultures and differences, which I think is extremely important. 17 mentioned being able to communicate in another country in a native language, or abroad, basically. And also 17 people mentioned being able to think like an outsider, because when you're coming from a different culture, you have a very different perspective on things. 14 mentioned being able to acquire additional languages. 12 positively impacting the environment by being bicultural, bilingual, and twice exceptional. 11 mentioned being appreciated for just being bilingual and multilingual and multicultural. And then there were some open-ended responses that didn't fit with the question. My last question was an open-ended question about what is the most important change that you would like to see so that your kids or you yourself are better supported. And there were several themes that I gathered from these open-ended responses, and I split them into school-related and non-school-related. So this page is dedicated to school-related responses and themes. So the number one thing that was mentioned was, we need more giftedness and neurodivergence resources and training for teachers. Number two, several people again mentioned this, twice exceptional specialists on staff at schools, colleges, and universities. Number three, access to school personnel who can communicate with the child and parents in their native language. And it's very important to make sure that it's not just a translator who is able to speak in the native language, but it's also a translator who understands the right terms within the giftedness and special education fields. Because I've heard stories that when the translators were available, but they didn't translate things correctly because they were not familiar with the terms that are used in the giftedness and special education fields. Number four was flexibility in schooling environment that allows us to meet kids where they're at. And finally, schooling with both languages included and native language clubs. Other themes that are not school related that emerged from open-ended responses were the following. The number one, overwhelmingly, was access to assessors who can conduct neuropsychological evaluations in the child's native language. I think this is important. This is something that we faced with. And in fact, I only know of one psychologist who can conduct neuropsychological evaluations in Russian in the US. Acceptance of non-white Russian-speaking individuals, which is an interesting one because even I often forget that Russian-speaking people don't necessarily look white because Russia and former Soviet Union are huge countries, and lots of different ethnicities are part of those countries. More information on neurodiversity available in Russian, and this is exactly the void that I'm trying to fill with my Substack, where I post about my personal experiences with twice exceptionality, giftedness, and learning differences in Russian and Ukrainian. Free and available psychological support services for twice exceptional families. More resources and support encourage transitioning research and development. And finally, and I'm really sad and disappointed that I have to mention it, separation of politics and culture. One respondent mentioned that they were approached by their school district and asked to express their attitude to the Russo-Ukrainian war that is going on right now. And I believe this is not acceptable and has nothing to do with education and especially children that we're talking about. And so something to keep in mind. And so I'd like to conclude by talking a little bit about why should we care? Why should we talk about supporting culturally diverse families and children? Why is it important, in addition to the fact that they're all humans and we will want to support human beings of all different kinds? But I also want to say that these kids, these twice exceptional and culturally diverse kids, are gonna grow up and become adults, and they will have an opportunity to think like an outsider because they come from a different culture, and thinking like an outsider can enhance divergent thinking and cognitive flexibility. It can also have an impact by bringing your own customs and ideas to the existing environment, which is one of the benefits mentioned by some of my respondents to my survey. And finally, it can lead to generation of ideas, again, because you come from a different perspective and can have a different perspective on things and generate different ideas and solutions. Further, because I come from the tech industry, there were a number of studies published by McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group that basically say that diversity is good. Diversity is good for companies. Diversity is good for revenue. So here's one of the quotes from McKinsey study. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on their executive teams were 21% more likely to experience above average profitability than companies in the bottom quartile. And if we're talking about cultural diversity, again, which is the topic of today's discussion, then that number was even higher. Similarly, Boston Consulting Group mentions that companies who are diverse have above average diversity scores. Are basically 20% higher in terms of their innovation revenue, as opposed to the companies with below average diversity scores. And then finally, another illustration from the study by Boston Consulting Group. It's a little difficult to read, but bear with me. So if you're looking at these pairs of bubbles on the right, the green and red bubble, what they're trying to say is that if you look at the top leftmost one, if you have 23 managers from different nations of origin, and these 23 managers constitute 1.5% of the entire managerial team, then the revenue of your company goes up by 1%. Similarly, if you hire managers from different industries, and there are 30 of them, and they constitute 2.0% of the entire team, then the revenue of your company goes up by 1%. And similarly, the other two pairs illustrate the same idea. And so this is all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for listening. Here are some references to some research and studies and books that I've used for this presentation. And keep in touch. Here's how to contact me. Once again, I'm Ekaterina Katrina O'Neill. I'm a doctoral student at Bridges Graduate School of Cognitive Diversity and Education. I'm also sort of trying to be a culturally inclusive neurodiversity advocate. I'm also an cybersecurity professional, and I am a mother of two twice exceptional children. Thank you so much.